Good news about our Sony A9 review. I thought this was important enough to publish a quick update. We originally tested the buffer as taking about 2 minutes to unload, and I believe that was due to a bug in the A9 that I had, like my particular copy. The reason being that Max Yuryev, our friend, tested the buffer unloading time of a UHS-II card in slot number 1 as taking 36 seconds, whereas we tested it at about 2 minutes. Our 2-minute time was about the same as Max's time for a UHS-I card. Now, both the camera and the card were pre-production, so I think the most likely explanation is that my camera misidentified the card as being UHS-I. Another possibility is that I had previously written to 2 cards simultaneously. Slot number 2 is UHS-I, and thus would operate at the slower, about 2-minute unloading speed. And perhaps when I took that second card out, the camera, because of a bug, did not properly return to UHS-II speeds, because of course if you're writing 2 cards, it would have to slow down to the pace of the slower slot. So just that bit of good news. I think if you're considering pre-ordering the camera, you can assume that it will actually clear a buffer if you're writing to 1 card in about 36 seconds. If you're writing to 2 cards, it will still take closer to 2 minutes, however, and at least for us, we pretty much would always be writing to 2 cards, so we still kind of have to assume that it's going to be that longer time. Another thing, a lot of people commented that they were surprised because nobody else said that it would shoot at slower than 20 frames per second. I found that when tracking a fast-moving subject, the frames per second would drop to about 10 to 12, and that didn't surprise me at all. That's kind of what I expected, which is why I counted the frames. The reason it didn't surprise me is that I saw the exact same thing from the Canon 1DX Mark II and the Nikon D5, and in fact, pretty much all cameras, especially, but it's more noticeable on the higher frame rate cameras, they have to take a beat between frames to check the focusing. That's why in the settings you'll see a slider that will allow you to adjust focusing between release priority and focus priority. If you have it on release priority, the camera will just fire off as fast as possible without worrying so much about focusing. If you have it on focus priority, it will actually slow down, make sure it locks in focus, and then actually release the shutter. So that itself means it'll slow it down some fraction of a second, some tiny amount. But if you're shooting at 20 frames a second, that's going to be a noticeable amount. So the difference in performance between a 1DX at 14 frames a second and A9 at 20 frames per second isn't as great as it initially seems. Of course, if you are maybe you're using back button focus and you let go of the back button focus because it's a stationary subject, somebody swinging a bat at a ball who isn't actually moving, you'll get that 20 frames per second. Likewise, you'll get the 14 frames per second out of the 1DX or the 12 out of the D5. Just keep those things in mind. We also had a lot of people saying, oh, who on earth really needs 20 frames per second? And I guarantee you, any serious sports photographer will appreciate the higher frame rates. Motor drives, since their invention in the film era, have largely been driven by sports photographers. Every new Olympics, Canon and Nikon would try to outdo each other by having a camera that's slightly faster, because those sports photographers really care. And we even had one person who said they didn't need 20 frames per second, they only needed 1 frame per second used at the right time. And I challenge anybody to go out there and use 1 frame to catch a ball hitting a bat or a soccer player kicking a ball and get that exact moment when the impact is. Even just a hockey player hitting a puck, try that with just 1 frame. Even with 20 frames a second, your odds of getting it are pretty low. I think you need to be like over 100 frames per second to have some kind of confidence. And as a sports photographer, you don't necessarily get to anticipate those things. A lot of people thought a 200 frame buffer was ridiculous, but it's actually not that impossible to fill up, especially if you do happen to be shooting at 20 frames per second. Like that's 10 seconds of shooting, but not necessarily 10 consecutive seconds. You could just be bursting 1 second at a time. And if you happen to be writing to 2 cards, as long as you could easily hit that by shooting for 10 seconds over the period of, a couple of minutes that the camera takes to unload that buffer. So it's not unreasonable that you could hit the buffer, but at the same time, with experience, you learn to mitigate it, you learn not to overshoot, and I think everybody was definitely overshooting with this new camera, including us, mostly because it's completely silent. We don't get the auditory feedback, and it's also faster than pretty much any camera that we've ever used. I want to reiterate that the A9 is a camera that we really liked. It's really good news that the buffer is unloading faster than we had originally tested. Of course, I've reached out to Sony. I just haven't happened to hear back, but I'm confident enough that it's a bug that I will tell people that you don't need to hold out your pre-orders based on that 2-minute measurement. I think it's something that will be fixed by the time the production camera goes away, but we're still waiting on official confirmation from Sony. Okay, thanks. Bye.